I'm gonna read the chapter about Cy Twombly, which I think is fitting because, as you'll find out in this chapter, Cy Twombly, the painter, also had a long relationship with the Virginia Museum and benefited, much as I did, from their enormous generosity to artists. I got a grant from the Virginia Museum, which was absolutely pivotal in my career, and I've never forgotten it. I remember I had to come to this very auditorium, and I had a nursing baby, and Willie Ann Wright babysat the squalling brat while I came up here. So I'm deeply in debt to the Virginia Museum, as was Cy, and you'll find out as I read this chapter. It is a testament to the allure of the area that the artist Cy Twombly, who lived and traveled in some of the world's most beautiful places, chose to live half the year in Lexington, his hometown. I can remember many afternoons walking to pick up the kids from school and seeing the tall, slightly stooped, densely overcoated and stocking-capped figure of Cy making his way down from his home on nearby Barclay Lane to the warehouse. He loved the spring in Virginia the way I do, with a hectic rapture at the beauty of it all. On pretty days, he would sometimes ask to be driven to the Walmart store, built on a commanding hilltop, where he would sit out on the benches by the exit doors and watch the spectacle of shoppers and the sun rays sweeping across the Blue Ridge Mountains in the distance. The light and mountains, the breezes and greens of the Mayapples, the warmth of the sun finally soaking into the earth and into his sometimes painful bones. Being in Virginia gave him great sensual joy. It gives joy to many of us, irrespective of the old bones or of the generation. The experience of growing up here is timeless and universal in certain ways. Cy's childhood experiences were remarkably similar to my own, despite the 24 years that separated us. I had a vision of how I wanted to live. In 1969, my parents and I had visited Helen and Scott Nearing on their subsistence farm in Maine, and I had made a heavily underscored mental note that this was exactly what I wanted for myself. A life of simplicity, pluck, seclusion, and soul-satisfying, ecological, sweat-of-the-brow, we'll vote with our lives, self-sufficiency. 7 years later, Larry and I were giving it a go. A commercial pilot we know once remarked that from the air, our house resembled those shanty towns on the edge of the Mexico City dump, and we were not offended. It was a totally cool, Big Surish house, impractical, whimsical, not to code in any respect. The kind of place that stopped passersby in their tracks and lured them, cautious and curious, past the basilisk sculptures to our slab wood front door. Cy, too, would wander down from the warehouse to that door, calling out in his hesitant, distinctive voice, "Sally, are you receiving?" We both liked to sit out on the wisteria-covered back deck, overlooking the creek, especially on those sultry summer nights when the fog rose from the bottomland and wisped among the racemes of white bloom. Nobody disputes that Cy produced some of the greatest art of this and the last century, and he made much of it right here in Virginia, not in spite of the place, but because of it. Choosing to work outside the art world's urban centers, as both he and I have done, is difficult. At least it certainly has been for me. More than any artist I know, Cy managed this classical remove, embracing James Joyce's artistic intent, summed up in 3 words at the end of a portrait of the artist as a young man: silence, exile, cunning. I miss him now each spring and fall, the seasons when he would alight in our valley, and I miss him for lots of reasons, but especially because of his irreverence, his confidence in his and my art, and how comfortable he was working outside the urban art world. I miss our afternoons at the kitchen table over his favorite meal, tart apples fried on the wood stove with a cast iron skillet with bacon fat, salt, cinnamon, and brown sugar. We would chat about stuff, not always art, but at the mention of some piece of criticism or a highbrow article, Cy and I, both of us with sensitive bullshit meters when it comes to art speak, would roll our eyes. When Cy spoke about art, he often used the language of the passions, language I understand, often referring to our daughter Jessie's style of painting as fierce. He understood the quirky ways we outliers have of measuring the strength of our work, remarking that his strongest paintings were usually those not sold by the end of the opening. My affinity for Cy and his approach to art, and my deep affection for him, gave me confidence that I could stay in this place I love and make my work here.